Brian Johnson spends $2 a year to not die. You have a cold shower.
It's quite the stark contrast when you really look at the landscape of modern health right now.
Yeah, the sheer lengths some people will go to, the massive amounts of capital they deploy.
And the teams of doctors they employ.
Right, all of that contrasted against a biological intervention that is, well, freely available right now in your own bathroom.
Exactly.
Welcome to our deep dive. If you're joining us today, you are likely that curious learner who sees the, endless barrage of wellness content flooding your feed.
And you probably want to separate the actual verified neuroscience of modern biohacking from the sensationalized internet hype.
You're looking to understand what actually works, what is simply noise, and how to optimize your life without feeling completely overwhelmed by information overload.
That's the goal for today. We have a highly detailed stack of source materials to guide us through this exploration.
We really do.
We'll be analyzing transcripts and newsletters from the Huberman Lab, which meticulously detail the specific biological mechanisms of cold exposure.
And we are pairing that hard science with a deeply insightful cultural critique from a publication called The Brink.
Right. They focus on the psychological phenomenon they call dopamine fasting 2.0.
We also have a comprehensive medical review from HealthCrunch to Ground Us, along with several brilliant insights from Dr. Anna Lemke,
She's the director of Stanford's Addiction Medicine Clinic and the author of Dopamine Nation.
which will be super crucial when we start talking about the brain's reward pathways later on.
Definitely. The overarching mission for this deep dive is to unpack the two biggest, most pervasive trends in what we might call biohacking light.
Cold plunges and dopamine fasting.
We are going to look closely at the undeniable hard data of what freezing water actually does to your brain chemistry and your body.
Then we'll contrast that with the highly misunderstood and, let's face it, culturally loaded practice of dopamine detoxing.
Ultimately, we want to figure out what is grounded in reality, what is pure behavioral metaphor, and who is actually profiting off your perfectly natural desire to optimize your life.
It's a journey that takes us from measurable neurochemical data straight into the heart of modern psychological coping mechanisms.
It really.
Okay, let's unpack this. We need to start by setting the physical scene for you, the listener.
Paint the picture.
Imagine you wake up, you walk in your bathroom, you turn the shower dial all the way to the coldest possible setting, and you step in.
Or perhaps you're stepping into a tub filled with ice water right up to your neck.
Right. The physical reality of that exact moment is pure, unadulterated shock.
Your breath catches in your throat.
Your skin tightens immediately, and your brain is basically screaming at you to get out of the water.
But what is actually happening beneath the surface on a microscopic level?
To truly understand that immediate physiological reaction, we need to ground our discussion in one of the foundational pieces of research in this field.
We're looking at a study published in the European Journal of Applied Physiology back in the year 2000.
Led by a researcher named Sramek, right?
Correct. What makes this specific study so critical, even over 2 decades later, is that it meticulously tracked the physiological and neurochemical responses to water immersion over an extended period.
When I was looking through the notes on this study, the exact parameters they used really stood out to me.
In what way?
Well, especially for anyone listening who assumes they need to chop a hole in a frozen lake to see any biological return on investment.
Yeah, that is a very common misconception driven by social media aesthetics.
Exactly.
The subjects in the Shramek study were not subjected to extreme freezing near zero temperatures.
They weren't?
No, they were immersed in water that was 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 14 degrees Celsius.
So chilly, but not ice.
Right. They were submerged up to their necks, keeping their heads above water, and they stayed there for up to an hour.
Now, 60 degrees is certainly cold, and sitting in it for an hour is a massive psychological and physical challenge.
But it's a far cry from the ultra-cold 30-degree ice baths you often see heavily promoted by influencers.
Right, it's a completely accessible temperature. You could achieve 60 degrees in almost any standard household shower.
Yet, even at that moderate temperature, the neurochemical data they pulled from the blood serum of these subjects was staggering.
The specific blood data is what drives this entire scientific conversation.
The researchers found that plasma levels of norepinephrine, which is also known as noradrenaline, increased by 530%.
Wow.
Furthermore, dopamine, the neurotransmitter we most heavily associate with motivation, reward, and mood regulation, increased by 250%.
I want to pause on that specific number for a second.
Right.
It's a 250% increase in dopamine on a page doesn't really translate to a lived human experience.
It's hard to contextualize.
Let's provide a framework for what that actually means for your brain. We know from broader neurological studies how different everyday activities affect our baseline dopamine levels.
Right, like eating.
Yeah, eating a piece of chocolate, for instance, triggers a dopamine increase of roughly 50% above baseline.
Okay.
Engaging in sex produces an increase of approximately 100%.
So a 250% increase in dopamine from simply sitting in 60-degree water is entirely on another level.
It crushes chocolate and sex. It's directly comparable to the dopamine spike produced by using cocaine, which also sits right around that 250% mark.
What's fascinating here is the massive qualitative difference in how the human body processes that identical percentage of dopamine depending on how it was introduced.
How so?
Well, when someone introduces a powerful stimulant or a recreational drug like cocaine into their system to achieve that 250% spike, the mechanism is exogenous.
Meaning it's coming from the outside.
Exactly. The drug forces the brain to flood the synapses with dopamine, and crucially, it often blocks the brain's ability to clear that dopamine away.
So it just sits there.
Yes, but that artificial flood is inevitably followed by a rapid, severe crash. The system is entirely depleted. Over time, this mechanism leads to receptor downregulation.
Meaning the brain essentially turns down its own sensitivity because it's being overwhelmed.
Precisely. The baseline dopamine level drops, requiring more of the external substance just to feel a normal baseline level of motivation.
Which is the biological pathway to addiction.
Exactly.
But wait, if the dopamine spike from cold water is exactly the same height as the spike from cocaine, 250%, why wouldn't it result in the exact same catastrophic crash the next day? A spike is a spike, isn't it?
It seems like it should be, but the mechanism of delivery changes everything. Unlike drugs, the dopamine release triggered by deliberate cold exposure occurs through a natural endogenous mechanism.
Generated entirely from within.
Because the body is releasing its own stores in response to an environmental stressor, it doesn't lead to that rapid crash or depletion.
So what happens instead?
Instead, the elevation in dopamine and norepinephrine has a long, sustained tail. It lasts for 2 to 3 hours post-exposure, gently tapering off.
So it's essentially a time-release capsule of motivation and focus.
Exactly. It's
Mm.
what in biology we call a controlled stress. Rather than depleting the neurotransmitter systems, this brief, deliberate stressor actually appears to upregulate them. It essentially trains the brain to manufacture and release dopamine more effectively over time without damaging the delicate receptor network.
So you get the intense mood elevation, the sharp focus, the alertness, but your biological bank account isn't overdrawn the next morning.
That's a great way to put it.
Where exactly in the body is this chemical cocktail being manufactured and released when the cold hits your skin?
When you enter that cold environment, the thermal shock on your skin immediately triggers your sympathetic nervous system.
The fight or flight response.
Right. This sends an urgent signal to a very specific small cluster of neurons in the brainstem called the locus coeruleus.
The locus coeruleus.
The locus coeruleus goes to work, signaling alongside the adrenal glands to release a class of chemicals known as catecholamines.
Let's define that term for a listener because catecholamine sounds like something from an advanced chemistry textbook.
Catecholamines are simply a category of neurotransmitters and hormones that the body produces in response to stress.
Okay.
The primary ones are dopamine, epinephrine, which is adrenaline, and norepinephrine. They are the chemical messengers of action and alertness.
And there's a very specific nuance to this chemical release, according to the SREMIC data, that I think is the most counterintuitive part of this whole biological mechanism.
The cortisol data.
Yes. You would naturally assume that jumping into freezing water would send your body into a state of total biological panic.
Hmm.
But the blood data showed something entirely different regarding stress hormones.
That is a crucial and fascinating distinction in the literature. In that study, alongside those massive soaring spikes in dopamine and norepinephrine, the researchers observed the distinct absence of a massive cortisol spike.
And cortisol is the bad guy, right? The chronic stress hormone.
Calling it the bad guy is a bit of a simplification, as we need cortisol to wake up in the morning.
Fair point.
But yes, it is the hormone most associated with chronic stress, anxiety, and the feeling of biological panic.
So what deliberate cold exposure creates is a highly unique physiological state.
You have incredibly high alertness, intense focus, and mood elevation driven by the catecholamines, but you're not flooded with the chronic panic hormone.
It's a state of being highly activated and alert, but biologically stable and calm.
Exactly.
We spend a lot of time on the brain, But the sources also dive heavily into what is happening to the physical tissue of the body, specifically what happens to our fat cells.
To understand this, we need to draw a clear line between the different types of fat we carry, because not all fat is created equal.
Most of what we think of as body fat, the stuff around our midsection, is white fat.
If you look at it under a microscope, it's essentially a single, large lipid droplet.
It's a low metabolic storage unit. It just sits there holding on to excess calories in case of a famine.
In stark contrast to white fat, humans also possess beige and brown fat. Brown fat actually looks dark under a microscope
Why is it brown?
because it is absolutely packed with iron-rich mitochondria.
The powerhouses of the cell.
Because of this density, beige and brown fat are highly metabolically active. They don't act like storage units.
They act like furnaces.
Exactly. Their primary biological function is thermogenesis, which literally means the creation of heat. They burn calories specifically to generate heat and increase your core body temperature.
This brings us to a major piece of research from 2024, published in the journal Advanced Biology. This study mapped exactly how cold exposure fundamentally changes the physical structure of your fat.
The mechanics at play here are beautifully complex. When you're exposed to cold water, that massive surge of norepinephrine we just discussed doesn't merely go to your brain to make you feel alert.
It circulates through your bloodstream and binds directly to specific receptors on the surface of your white fat cells.
It's sending a chemical text message to your belly fat.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
This binding triggers the release of a specific protein within the fat cell called UCP1, or uncoupling protein 1.
What UCP1 does is quite remarkable. It uncouples the normal energy production process in the mitochondria.
Instead of using energy to create ATP, which the cell uses for normal functions,
It forces the mitochondria to just bleed off that energy as pure heat.
this initiates a genetic and cellular change that actually converts the low metabolic white fat into highly thermogenic beige and brown fat.
So by getting into cold water, you're literally remodeling your tissue.
You're turning those inert storage units into active furnaces.
Right.
And that means you are establishing an ongoing increase in your core baseline metabolism, even when you're sitting at your desk later that afternoon.
That's the metabolic payoff. But the 2024 Advanced Biology study noted something else happening at the microscopic cellular level.
Something involving a very specific type of protein called a cold shock protein.
The sources mention RBM3.
What exactly is a cold shock protein?
RBM3 stands for RNA binding motif protein 3. When your cells are exposed to the sudden, drastic stress of a cold environment, they recognize that they're in a potentially damaging situation.
To protect themselves, they ramp up the production of these cold shock proteins.
RBM3 acts as a cellular shield. It enhances the structural resilience of the cell.
It's essentially the body's emergency repair crew.
Exactly. It's a prime example of a biological concept called hormesis.
Hormesis is the principle that a moderate, controlled, intermittent stressor can trigger beneficial adaptations in the body that far exceed any initial minor damage caused by the stressor itself.
What's truly exciting in the current literature is that the increased production of RBM3 is being heavily studied for its theoretical anti-aging effects.
And specifically, its ability to protect neural synapses in the brain from degrading over time.
Okay, let's step back and look at the whole picture we have painted so far.
We've established that cold plunging is adding a very real, very measurable, intense physical stress to the body to force a chemical and cellular upgrade.
You add acute discomfort to your life in order to feel incredibly good and resilient afterward.
Now let's look at the flip side of the biohacking coin that our sources cover.
If cold plunging is a deliberate addition of discomfort, dopamine fasting is about the deliberate removal of pleasure.
It's the exact inverse approach to human optimization.
Where cold exposure leverages a massive, sudden flood of intense sensory stimulation, dopamine fasting seeks a total, sweeping blackout of stimulation.
The aesthetic of the modern dopamine faster is incredibly distinct. If you look at the Reddit confessionals on places like r/dopamine detoxing,
Or if you watch the intricate, highly curated dopamine menus on TikTok.
you see these intense, almost monastic vows being taken by normal people. They declare, no screams, no music, no junk food, no dopamine. I am rebuilding my brain from scratch.
They vow to endure 72 hours of sitting in a room, staring at a blank wall, making no eye contact with their family, eating only unseasoned food.
All in an attempt to hit a biological reset button on their neurochemistry.
It's a striking cultural phenomenon. But to understand how we arrived at this aesthetic of extreme digital asceticism, we have to look back at the true origin story of the movement.
The concept first gained mainstream visibility back in 2019, primarily through a viral Medium post titled The Definitive Guide to Dopamine Fasting 2.0.
Who actually wrote that guide? Was it a neuroscientist?
It was written by Dr. Cameron Sipa. He's a clinical psychologist who was working as an advisor for Y Combinator, the famous startup accelerator in Silicon Valley.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When you read Dr. Sipa's original intent, he never intended for this to be a literal chemical purge of neurotransmitters.
He absolutely did not. Dr. Sipa designed dopamine fasting 2.0 purely as a cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, technique.
At the time, he was working directly with Silicon Valley tech workers who were struggling with severe, compulsive, instant reward-seeking habits.
We're talking about crippling doom scrolling, obsessive email checking at 3 a.m., and compulsive video gaming that was destroying their productivity and personal lives.
And CBT, just to clarify for the listener, is a psychological treatment that focuses on changing unhelpful cognitive distortions and behaviors.
Improving emotional regulation and developing personal coping strategies.
Correct. The goal of Dr. Sipa's protocol was simply stimulus control.
It was designed to restrict those highly impulsive, problematic behaviors to specific windows of time in order to regain executive control over their lives.
He used the word dopamine in the title simply because it was a catchy, recognizable term that helped explain how behavioral addictions are reinforced in the brain.
It was entirely a metaphor.
But the internet, as it always does, took the metaphor incredibly literally.
People started believing that dopamine was some sort of toxic substance pooling in their frontal lobes.
And that if they just suffered enough sheer boredom, they could flush it out of their system like a juice cleanse for the brain.
Which brings us to the hard neuroscientific reality that the sources address. Major medical institutions, including Harvard Health and the Cleveland Clinic, have been very clear in debunking the pseudoscience that rapidly grew around the trend.
First and foremost, dopamine is not a toxin. It is a naturally occurring, absolutely vital neurotransmitter.
I think people confuse dopamine with pleasure. They think dopamine is the feeling of eating a cupcake.
That is the most common misunderstanding. Dopamine isn't actually the molecule of pleasure. It's the molecule of motivation, seeking, and craving.
It's what makes you want to go get the cupcake.
It's essential for learning, physical movement, and basic daily motivation. Furthermore, it's not a finite reservoir in your brain that you can drain or flush out by sitting in a dark room.
Dr. Anna Lemke from Stanford frames this perfectly in her work. She points out that dopamine spikes and dips are a completely normal part of the human biological rhythm.
Her research utilizes the metaphor of a balance scale between pleasure and pain in the brain.
The brain simply does not reset its complex dopamine receptor network just because you locked your smartphone in a kitchen drawer and stared at a wall for 3 days.
You fundamentally cannot fast from a naturally occurring brain chemical that regulates your heartbeat and your ability to walk across a room.
Therefore, the pervasive online premise that feeling irritable during a tech detox is a sign of toxins leaving the brain
Or that total social isolation will medically repair your neural pathways.
is scientifically flawed. The biology simply doesn't work that way.
But this raises a really compelling question, one that I think is central to this entire deep dive.
If the underlying science of flushing dopamine is completely debunked, why do so many intelligent people swear by the practice?
Why do these subreddits have hundreds of thousands of members claiming that sitting in silence changed their lives and cured their brain fog?
That is the crux of the issue. Because while the neurochemical explanation they're using is a myth, the psychological reality of the practice they're engaging in is highly effective.
Even if you aren't physically resetting your dopamine receptors, by engaging in this practice, you're successfully disrupting deeply ingrained stimulus response loops.
Let's break down what a stimulus response loop looks like for the listener.
When you feel a moment of social anxiety, your immediate response might be to pull out your phone and open Instagram.
The anxiety is the stimulus, opening the app is the response.
Over time, that becomes a subconscious, hardwired loop. By removing the cues entirely,
Turning off the notifications, deleting the infinite scroll apps, removing the hyperpalatable sugar,
you physically break the habitual cycle. You cannot execute the response.
you're stepping off the treadmill. You're drastically reducing digital fatigue.
Exactly. When you quiet the constant, overwhelming external noise of the modern world, even for just a few hours a day, you create a vital psychological space.
You create the room necessary for purposeful decisions. You shift your brain from a state of reflexive, automatic action to a state of conscious observation.
Instead of just pulling out your phone, you start actually noticing the physical urge to check your phone.
You feel the anxiety that prompts the urge. That tiny pause between a stimulus happening and your response to it is incredibly powerful for mental health.
But the sources from the brink highlight a darker, much more profound psychological draw to this practice.
It goes way beyond just wanting to focus a bit better on a spreadsheet at work.
It's fundamentally about the illusion, or perhaps the reality, of control.
In a modern world, driven by incredibly sophisticated algorithms that are quite literally engineered by thousands of engineers to hijack our attention,
Choosing total abstinence feels like the ultimate act of personal sovereignty.
it's a profound reclamation of autonomy. So many people feel like they're operating on autopilot, dictated by the ping of a notification.
Denying oneself pleasure, engaging in voluntary hardship becomes the only tangible proof that they are still the captain of their own ship, that they are still in charge of their own minds.
This taps into a deeply rooted psychological concept first articulated by Sigmund Freud, known as the repetition compulsion.
That's the psychoanalytic idea that humans don't merely seek out pleasure, which seems counterintuitive.
We often unconsciously seek out or deliberately relive painful or uncomfortable experiences in order to gain mastery over them.
Correct. We willingly return to the site of our psychological struggle in an attempt to give shape and boundaries to our internal chaos.
Seen through this specific Freudian lens, the extreme discomfort of a 72-hour dopamine fast isn't an unfortunate side effect.
It's the entire point of the exercise.
The visceral pain of boredom, the acute agitation of digital withdrawal, reassures the faster that they can still instill boundaries on their own behavior.
That they aren't entirely ruled by corporate algorithms and base impulses.
It closely resembles a modern secular form of Puritanism.
If you spend time in these online optimization communities, you see that they function very much like digital monasteries.
They have incredibly specific, rigid rules. They have public forums for confessions of relapse. They prescribe periods of penance.
In this specific ecosystem, the anxiety and the withdrawal symptoms aren't viewed as negative things to be avoided.
They're read as tangible signs of progress.
A relapse, like accidentally checking a YouTube short during a designated fasting window, is framed not as a minor mistake, but as a deep spiritual struggle.
The pursuit of optimal neurological health becomes deeply intertwined with a very old human need for redemptive suffering.
This deep dive into the culture of suffering brings us to a crucial intersection in our analysis.
If we look at both cold water immersion and putting your smartphone in a drawer, at their very core, they're entirely free activities.
Yet around these free, basic human actions, a massive, highly lucrative, multi-million-dollar wellness subculture has industrialized.
It's the ultimate irony of modern biohacking. You can walk into your bathroom right now and turn your shower dial to cold for $0.
You can hold the power button on your phone and turn it off for $0.
But these incredibly simple ancient hacks have spawned an economic ecosystem worth millions.
If we impartially examine that ecosystem based on our sources, we can see exactly how the dissemination of this health information operates in the modern era.
For instance, figures like Dr. Andrew Huberman have built massive, unprecedented audiences by providing incredibly deep, science-based protocols on these exact biological topics.
And this reach now extends far beyond digital platforms or YouTube. It has moved into large-scale, in-person live tours, such as the Brain Body Contract events.
Which sell out massive theaters in cities like Seattle and Portland.
And alongside the distribution of all this free, highly valuable biological information, there's a very heavy, very visible presence of premium corporate sponsorships.
Supplement companies like AG1 and Thorne are deeply integrated into the presentation of these biohacking protocols.
They offer foundational vitamins, complex adaptogens, and highly specific targeted supplement stacks
That are explicitly designed and marketed to augment the exact biological processes being discussed in the lectures.
The commodification of these practices extends far beyond just powdered greens and magnesium supplements.
The concept of dopamine fasting, which, as we established, started as a stressed-out guy in a hoodie turning off his Wi-Fi router in Silicon Valley, has been repackaged.
You can now book luxury detox retreats in India, complete with 5-star spa treatments, silent meditation gardens, and organic meals.
All to help you not look at your phone.
And in the physical realm of cold exposure, we see the rapid development of highly specialized, expensive biotech gear.
The perfect example from the source material is the CoolMint device, which was heavily referenced in the Huberman materials.
Yes, the CoolMint is a fascinating piece of technology. It was developed by a researcher named Dr. Craig Heller at Stanford University.
How does it actually work? Because from what I read, it solves a very specific biological bottleneck that happens when you get too cold.
It does. Dr. Heller's research focuses on specialized blood vessels called arteriovenous anastomoses, or AVAs.
These are concentrated in the glabrous skin surfaces of the body.
And for anyone wondering what glabrous means, it simply refers to the hairless, smooth parts of your body, specifically the palms of your hands, the soles of your feet, and the upper half of your face.
Exactly. These glabrous areas have a unique network of blood vessels that act basically like the body's radiator system.
The problem with traditional cold exposure, like an ice bath, is a process called vasoconstriction.
If you put a freezing ice pack on your chest, your body panics. The blood vessels at the surface immediately constrict, or shrink, to keep the warm blood safely tucked away in your vital organs.
So you actually stop losing heat, which blunts the cooling effect.
So by getting too cold too fast, your body shuts down the very cooling process you're trying to trigger.
Precisely. The CoolMint is designed to extract the performance-enhancing metabolic benefits of cooling the core body temperature without triggering that vasoconstriction.
It cools the glabrous skin on the palms to a very specific temperature.
Cold enough to cool the blood circulating through those AVAs, but not so cold that the blood vessels constrict.
The cooled blood then circulates back to the heart and lowers the core body temperature highly efficiently.
It's a highly engineered commercial solution to a biological problem.
It all feeds into what the cultural critics in our sources call the cult of optimization.
There is a palpable groupthink that inevitably forms around prominent biohacking figures.
The pursuit of health slowly stops being about simply feeling better and having more energy for your kids, and it merges with these intense, often male-coded discipline ideologies.
Things like monk mode, the relentless grind set culture on social media, or movements like NoFap.
It shifts from a health intervention to a performative ritual. Physical and mental endurance becomes the ultimate virtue.
Pain is no longer viewed as a warning signal from the body that something is wrong. It's viewed entirely as an investment in a superior version of the self.
And the danger of this mindset is that the higher the pedestal of behavioral purity is built, the further and more devastating the inevitable fall when a human being inevitably breaks a rule.
Which highlights the absolute core tension of this entire deep dive.
On one hand, you have cold water exposure, which provides real, measurable, undeniable neurochemical and metabolic data.
On the other hand, you have dopamine fasting, which we've discovered is largely a behavioral metaphor wrapped in pseudoscientific language.
Yet online optimization culture treats both of these practices with the exact same level of religious reverence.
They're both presented as holy scripture in the Church of Biohacking.
This raises an important practical question. How do we separate the ritualistic performance from the actual verified results?
How does someone listening to us right now actually apply the verified science to their daily routine without falling into the psychological trap of performative suffering?
So what does this all mean? How do you, the listener, use this information safely and effectively starting tomorrow morning? Let's bring this all back down to earth and look at the actual minimum effective dose required to get the benefits of cold exposure.
The most scientifically grounded, accessible protocol currently available in the literature comes from the research of Dr. Susanna Soberg.
Her findings are incredibly reassuring because they indicate that you don't need to suffer in a freezing lake for hours a week to reap the metabolic and neurochemical rewards we've discussed.
The target she identified is remarkably achievable. Aim for just 11 minutes of deliberate cold exposure per week in total.
I really want to emphasize that for you. 11 minutes total for the entire week, not 11 minutes every single day.
You can easily spread that across 2 to 4 sessions of just 1 to 5 minutes each.
And regarding the specific temperature of the water, colder is not inherently better for achieving these specific adaptations.
The optimal range identified in Dr. Sayberg's research is between 50 and 59 degrees Fahrenheit, or 10 to 15 degrees Celsius.
The best psychological gauge you should use is this. The water should be uncomfortable enough that the moment you get in, your brain immediately thinks, I really want to get out.
But you also possess the rational knowledge that you can stay in safely without risking hypothermia.
The sources also highlight a few highly specific pro tips to maximize the biological return on that 11-minute weekly investment.
The first is a concept known in the literature as the Seeberg principle.
The Seeberg principle is incredibly simple to execute, but crucial for the metabolic benefits, and with cold.
When you finish your cold exposure session, whether it's a plunge or a shower, do not immediately jump into a hot shower and do not immediately wrap yourself in a heated towel.
You want to force your body to reheat on its own.
By demanding that your body generate its own heat to return to homeostasis, you maximize the thermogenic and metabolic benefits of the brown fat activation we discussed earlier.
Which leads directly to the second major pro tip from the research: shivering.
When we get cold, our instinct is to tense up our shoulders, cross our arms, and try to suppress the shiver.
But the science says you actually want to let yourself shiver.
Yes, you do. While it's naturally tempting to tense up, the physical, rhythmic act of shivering from the muscles causes the release of a specific molecule called succinate.
Succinate plays a key role in further activating that brown fat thermogenesis.
It's a vital part of the metabolic signaling process that tells the fat to act like a furnace. If you suppress the shiver, you suppress a portion of the metabolic benefit.
The final pro tip addresses the mental game of the plunge, what Huberman often refers to as counting walls.
When you first get into the cold water, your mind will immediately build a wall, a severe psychological barrier screaming at you to quit and turn off the water.
Every single time you hit one of those mental walls and want to bail, you're actually experiencing a distinct physical pulse of adrenaline in your system.
Viewing those barriers not as panic, but objectively as chemical pulses and purposefully breathing and pushing past a few of them is exactly how you leverage the cold water to build real-world mental resilience.
It's a resilience that translates far outside the ice bath and into your stressful workday.
However, recognizing and breathing through adrenaline pulses requires a foundational baseline of physical safety.
Absolutely. Which means we must deliver the honest, required medical disclaimer. Temperature is an incredibly powerful biological stimulus, and cold shock is a very real medical danger that can lead to hyperventilation or cardiac issues.
You must progress gradually. If you have never done this, do not buy a chest freezer tomorrow.
Start with just 30 seconds of cold water at the very end of your regular warm shower. Most importantly, consult a board-certified physician before embarking on any extreme temperature protocols, especially if you have any underlying cardiovascular issues. Know your own limits.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it really forces us to pause and reflect on the modern human condition we find ourselves in.
How so? What is the overarching theme you see connecting the cold water to the dopamine fast?
Think deeply about the two extreme practices we've unpacked today. On one side of the spectrum, we're increasingly willing to plunge our physical bodies into freezing, deeply uncomfortable water just to artificially trigger the release of ancient survival chemicals.
Dopamine and norepinephrine, simply to feel alert, motivated, and alive during our desk jobs.
On the exact opposite side of the spectrum, we're locking our devices in time safes and isolating ourselves in silent retreats, frantically trying to escape the highly weaponized engineered dopamine of our smartphones and social feeds.
We're artificially inducing physical stress just to feel a baseline of vitality, and we're artificially inducing extreme boredom just to feel a baseline of sanity.
Precisely. What does that dichotomy actually say about the modern daily environment we've built for ourselves?
Are we truly utilizing biohacking to thrive, to reach our peak human potential, or are we just desperately, frantically trying to build a biological and psychological tolerance to a fundamentally unnatural digital ecosystem?
Are we optimizing our lives? Or are we just trying to survive the algorithm?
It's a complex question, and it's absolutely worth asking yourself the next time you're standing under freezing water or the next time you're staring at a blank wall, trying not to check your email. Leave that thought simmering. Until next time.